It started as an ordinary day, one of those where you could swear you'd already lived it a dozen times before. The alarm blared its usual indignation, the coffee tasted as bitter as my mood, and I scrolled absent-mindedly through emails that seemed to exist only to irritate me. Life had settled into a monotony so dense that it felt like I was treading water in a sea of beige. But that evening, everything changed. The first sign was subtle. I felt an odd pressure, like an invisible hand pressing gently against my chest. I dismissed it, brushing it off as heartburn from the greasy takeout I'd scarfed down for lunch. But the pressure grew heavier, denser, until it felt as though my ribs were being bound by steel bands. My breath came in shallow gasps, and a cold sweat broke across my skin. It wasn't just physical discomfort, it was the creeping awareness that something was profoundly wrong. I stumbled to the couch, clutching my chest, each step an act of will. The room swam before my eyes, the colors of the walls seeming to bleed together like watercolors left out in the rain. A sharp pain exploded down my left arm, radiating outward in fiery tendrils. My heart thundered in my ears, erratic and frantic, like a drumbeat heralding some great and terrible event. Panic set in like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. My mind raced with fragmented thoughts. What's happening to me? Am I dying? Not now, not yet. I thought about the pile of unfinished projects on my desk at work, the laundry I'd left in the dryer, the dinner plans I'd casually canceled with a friend last week. My life flashed before me, not in some cinematic montage, but in the mundane details I'd always taken for granted. The pain grew unbearable, a hot, twisting knife in my chest. I dropped to my knees, my vision narrowing into a tunnel of darkness. The world around me began to dissolve, as if someone had taken an eraser to the edges of reality. Sound faded first, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, all swallowed by an oppressive silence. Then came the light, or rather, the absence of it. I wasn't unconscious, not exactly. I was aware, but the awareness felt detached, as though I were observing my body from a great distance. There was a surreal moment where I saw myself crumpled on the floor, my face pale and my body limp, like a marionette with its strings cut. The sight should have terrified me, but instead, a strange calm washed over me, an acceptance that I couldn't explain. The calm didn't last. A searing jolt ripped through me, pulling me away from the scene of my body. It was as if I were being dragged through a narrow, twisting tunnel, the walls pulsating with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The sensation was overwhelming, dizzying, disorienting, but not painful. It felt like being swept up in a current, carried toward something vast and unknowable. My senses began to warp, stretching and bending like reflections in a funhouse mirror. I could hear colors, taste sounds, feel time. Each moment stretched into eternity and collapsed into nothingness all at once. I was no longer bound by the limitations of my body, but that freedom came with its own kind of terror. I was untethered, floating in an endless void, stripped of everything I thought I knew about existence. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange beauty. The void wasn't empty, it was alive with an energy I couldn't name. It pulsed and shimmered, shifting between darkness and light, as though the universe itself were breathing. I reached out, or maybe I just willed it, and felt the energy respond, wrapping around me like a warm, weightless blanket. My thoughts turned inward. The fear of dying gave way to a deeper fear had I wasted my life. I thought about the moments I'd let slip by, the people I'd hurt, the dreams I'd abandoned out of fear or laziness. Regret clawed at me, sharp and relentless. But just as quickly as the regret surfaced, it began to dissolve, absorbed by the strange, comforting energy that surrounded me. It was as if the void was whispering to me, assuring me that all was not lost, that this was not the end. Then a new sensation emerged, a pull, gentle but insistent, guiding me towards something I couldn't see. I resisted at first, clinging to what little sense of self I had left. But the pull grew stronger, more urgent, and I realized there was no point in fighting it. I surrendered, letting the current take me. As I drifted further into the unknown, I became aware of a faint light in the distance. It was small at first, a pinprick in the vast darkness, but it grew steadily brighter, drawing me toward it like a moth to a flame. The light wasn't just illumination, it was alive. It pulsed with a warmth that reached deep into the core of my being, melting away every trace of fear and doubt. In that moment, I realized I was no longer afraid. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. The pain, the panic, the regret, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I felt as though I were on the brink of a great revelation, standing at the threshold of something vast and eternal. And then, just as I was about to cross into the light, everything went still. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. I was suspended in that moment, caught between two worlds, waiting for whatever came next. I emerged from the nothingness into a place that defied every law of nature I'd ever known. It was as if I had stepped into the space between realities, where nothing and everything existed at once. The air, or what I perceived as air, was thick with light, not the blinding, sterile kind you'd find in a hospital room, but a living, breathing radiance that seemed to hum with intention. It wasn't just light, it was a presence, ancient and aware, folding itself into the very fabric of the space around me. I drifted, weightless and untethered, and yet I didn't feel lost. If anything, I felt more connected than I ever had in my life, as though invisible threads bound me to every particle of this strange, luminous realm. Colors swirled around me, vibrant and infinite, bleeding into one another in ways I couldn't comprehend. They weren't just seen, but felt, resonating through me like music that bypassed the ears and sang directly to my soul. I had no body, not in the way I understood, but I was still me, stripped down to the essence of my existence. Ahead of me, the light seemed to shift, forming a translucent barrier that stretched endlessly in every direction. It shimmered like the surface of a still pond kissed by moonlight, and as I floated closer, I could see faint shapes moving behind it. At first, they were little more than shadows, amorphous and fleeting, but as I drew nearer, the shadows began to take form. People. I didn't recognize them at first, but there was something achingly familiar about the way they moved, the way they stood together as if waiting for me. My breath, or what would have been my breath, caught in my chest. These weren't strangers. They were pieces of my life, fragments of my story. The barrier between us shimmered and pulsed, as though it were alive, breathing in rhythm with the energy of the space. I reached out instinctively, but my hand, if I even had one, passed through it, met with no resistance. The first figure stepped forward, and my heart shattered and mended itself all at once. It was my grandmother, the woman who had been my anchor in childhood storms, whose laughter had been warm enough to light up entire winters. She looked exactly as I remembered her, but more radiant, more alive, more her. Her eyes, those deep, soulful pools I had always loved, shone with a light that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. She didn't speak, but her presence was louder than any words. Her gaze pierced through me, bypassing all the walls I had built in life. I felt seen in a way I never had before, as if she could hold my entire soul in her understanding. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. I didn't need them. Her voice, or what I understood as her voice, filled the space around me, echoing not in sound, but in feeling. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said, her tone a blend of love and urgency. The words weren't a rebuke, but a reminder, gentle yet firm. I tried to respond, but the emotions flooding me made it impossible to form coherent thoughts. Instead, images and feelings poured out of me, a torrent of unspoken words and unresolved memories. I showed her the guilt I carried, the mistakes I had made, the love I had left unspoken. She absorbed it all without flinching, her light wrapping around my brokenness like a balm. Before I could say more, another voice filled the space, one that wasn't hers. It was vast and resonant, carrying with it a weight that made every particle of my being tremble. It wasn't harsh or cruel, but it was absolute, undeniable. The voice spoke my name, and the sound of it cracked something open inside me. It was as if every wall I had ever built came crashing down in an instant. I turned toward the source of the voice, and the light that surrounded me seemed to intensify, growing brighter and brighter until it was all I could see. It wasn't just light anymore, it was everything. It was love and truth and eternity condensed into a singular, overwhelming presence. I felt pulled toward it, not by force, but by an irresistible gravity, like a moth drawn to the purest flame. As I moved closer, I became aware of the barrier again, its edges shimmering like the thinnest veil. I glanced back toward my grandmother and the others who stood with her, their faces filled with something I couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, or joy, or a mixture of both. She nodded toward the light, her silent encouragement wrapping around me like a warm embrace. The light seemed to reach for me, its radiance growing ever brighter, and I felt myself surrendering to it. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the sense that I was stepping into something far greater than myself. And then, just as I was about to cross through, the voice spoke again, stopping me in my tracks. It wasn't a command, but a question, one that echoed deep within me. Are you ready? The weight of those words settled on me, and for the first time, I hesitated. I looked back at the figures behind the barrier, their presence a reminder of the life I had left behind. My grandmother's gaze met mine, filled with a quiet knowing. I turned back to the light, caught between two worlds, and realized that I didn't know the answer. Not yet. The light engulfed me, but it wasn't just light. It was alive, surrounding me with a warmth so profound it felt as though it was pouring into every broken corner of my being. I wasn't just bathed in it, I was immersed, submerged, and utterly consumed by it. It wasn't blinding or harsh, but it carried a weight, an undeniable presence that pressed gently against me, not to crush, but to hold. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't just aware of love. I was love. It pulsed through me, more real than any sensation I had ever known, filling the gaps I hadn't realized existed. In the center of the light, a form began to take shape. At first, it was indistinct, a shifting figure of radiance. But as I focused, the details crystallized: feet, hands, a face. There was a human element to the figure, but it transcended anything I could compare to earthly form. His features were both familiar and impossible to fully grasp, as though they contained infinite expressions layered one atop the other. His eyes, those eyes held a depth so endless, it felt as though the entirety of existence was reflected within them. And I knew who he was. I didn't need an introduction, a name, or an explanation. My soul recognized him in a way that words could never capture. This was Jesus, not the distant figure from the stained glass windows of my childhood, or the abstract idea I had wrestled with in life. This was him, present and undeniable. His gaze locked onto mine, and in that instant I felt everything I had ever been laid bare. There was no hiding, no pretending, no facade. He saw all of me, every thought, every action, every secret I had buried deep within myself. It wasn't just my life that was being revealed, it was my very essence. The weight of his gaze should have crushed me, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like he was gently unraveling the knots I had tied within myself, one by one. There was no condemnation in his eyes, no anger or disappointment. There was only love, pure, unfiltered, and overwhelming. It wasn't the soft, fleeting love I had known in life. It was fierce and boundless, a love that pierced through the darkest parts of me and refused to let go. I wanted to weep, to fall to my knees, but I had no body to do so. I was simply present before him, stripped of all pretense. He didn't speak at first, not with words. Instead, his presence communicated in waves, a language of the soul that carried emotions and truths far deeper than anything I could have comprehended before. I felt his understanding, his knowing. Every failure, every regret, every shameful act I had ever tried to bury rose to the surface, not to accuse but to be acknowledged. And then, without a word, he wiped them away. The moment his voice reached me, it was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't sound, it was vibration, resonance, and life itself filling the space around me and within me. When he said my name, it was as though the universe itself had spoken. Every syllable was weighted with meaning, spoken with a care so precise that I felt the fullness of who I was in that single utterance. Masturbation. The word didn't come as an accusation, but as a revelation. It echoed through the space, not harshly, but with the kind of gravity that made me realize it wasn't just about the act. It was about what it represented. Shame rushed through me like a cold tide, followed by a desperate need to explain, to defend myself. But there were no words, no excuses that could hide from his knowing gaze. Instead of judgment, he showed me. In an instant, I was flooded with images, moments in my life where I had sought solace in isolation, where I had turned inward instead of outward, feeding a cycle of fleeting gratification that only deepened my loneliness. I saw how it shaped me, how it distorted my understanding of intimacy and love, how it subtly carved a barrier between myself and others. It wasn't just about the act, it was about what I had allowed it to take from me. Yet, even in the midst of this revelation, there was no anchor in him, no condemnation. His voice came again, gentle but firm, like the steady hand of a craftsman shaping clay. "Your body is a temple," he said, the words wrapping around me with both weight and tenderness. "What you feed your soul shapes the foundation of your spirit." The truth of his words struck me like lightning, illuminating parts of myself I had been too afraid to face. It wasn't about shame or punishment, it was about freedom. He was showing me that I had been enslaved, not by him, but by my own choices, my own patterns. And he was offering me a way out, not through force, but through love, through understanding, through a better way. I felt a release, as though chains I hadn't even known were binding me had fallen away. In their place was a lightness, a clarity I had never experienced before. He wasn't asking for perfection, he was inviting me to walk in a new direction, to see myself as he saw me, not as a failure, but as someone worth redeeming. The light around him pulsed, and for a moment I thought it might consume me entirely. But instead, it began to recede, leaving behind an imprint of his presence that would never leave me. His final words echoed in my soul, soft but unshakable. "You are loved. Go and live in that truth." The light began to shift, not fading but transforming, softening its intensity as if gently releasing me from its embrace. I was no longer surrounded by pure brilliance, but by a space that seemed to cradle the very essence of existence. It was vast and infinite, yet intimate, like the hollow of a cupped hand. Colors I had no name for swirled in the air, slow and deliberate, moving like whispers of a song I could almost hear. The atmosphere wasn't empty, it felt alive, vibrating with a quiet energy that hummed through me, a steady pulse of being that matched the rhythm of my soul. I floated, or at least that's how it seemed. There was no up or down, no sense of gravity or direction, yet I moved with an effortless ease, carried along by currents I couldn't see. Shapes began to emerge from the mist like colors, taking form slowly as if they were being painted onto the fabric of this reality by an unseen hand. At first, they were vague, amorphous, like shadows behind a curtain, but as I drifted closer, they solidified into recognizable figures. The first figure to step forward was my father. The sight of him sent a jolt through me, a bittersweet ache that spread from the core of my being outward. He looked as I remembered him before illness had taken its toll, strong, vibrant, his eyes filled with that same steady warmth that had always made me feel safe. He smiled, and it was as if the weight of years between us dissolved in an instant. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck me. It was his presence. He wasn't just my father here, he was more, as if every aspect of him had been stripped down to its purest, truest essence. He radiated a love so profound it seemed to spill into the air around him, enveloping me in a warmth that felt like coming home after a long journey. His voice didn't reach me through words, not exactly. It was more like a current of emotion and understanding flowing directly into my mind. "I'm proud of you," he conveyed, and the simple truth of it hit me like a wave. It wasn't pride for accomplishments or deeds. It was deeper than that, a recognition of my struggles, my growth, my attempts to find my way in a world that often felt too vast and chaotic. Before I could respond, another figure stepped forward, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Sarah, my childhood best friend, the one I'd lost in a car accident when we were barely 20. Her presence was a bittersweet melody, stirring up memories I'd long buried, summer days filled with laughter, midnight talks about dreams and fears, and the pain of losing her so suddenly. She looked at me with the same mischievous glint in her eye that I remembered. But there was a depth to her now, an understanding that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of time. "You've carried so much guilt," her voice echoed, soft but unyielding. I didn't need her to explain. I knew exactly what she meant. For years, I had blamed myself for her death, for not being there that night, for not saying the things I should have said while I had the chance. She reached out, not physically, but her essence brushed against mine, and I felt the weight of that guilt lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. More figures began to appear, one by one, each of them a thread in the tapestry of my life. Teachers, friends, even strangers whose faces I barely recognized but whose impact on me had been real, if fleeting. Each of them radiated a light unique to themselves, and yet there was a unity in their presence, as if they were all part of something much larger than any single life or moment. They didn't speak as much as reveal, their very presence unlocking memories and truths within me that I had long forgotten or ignored. It was as if they were mirrors, reflecting back the parts of me that had been shaped by their love, their kindness, their lessons. And in their reflection, I began to see myself more clearly, not as the sum of my mistakes, but as a soul in progress, loved and valued despite my flaws. At the edge of this gathering, a brighter figure stood, waiting patiently. There was something different about this presence, something more encompassing, as though it held the essence of all the others and more. When I turned my attention toward it, the entire space seemed to shift, the colors deepening, the air vibrating with a resonance that felt almost like a heartbeat. As I moved closer, the figure didn't speak or move, but its light reached out to me, wrapping around me like a mantle. In that embrace, I felt the overwhelming sense of purpose I had been missing, the understanding that my life wasn't an accident, that every moment of it, good and bad, had meaning. The figure didn't offer answers to the questions that had plagued me in life, but it gave me something far more profound, the assurance that I was never alone, that every step of my journey had been guided by a love far greater than I could comprehend. The figures around me began to fade, their light retreating back into the swirling colors, and I felt a pang of longing, a desire to stay in this place of perfect connection and understanding. But even as the space began to dissolve, I sensed a quiet urging, a pull back toward the life I had left behind. It wasn't a command, but an invitation, a reminder that my journey wasn't over, that there was still more for me to learn, to give, to experience. The vibrant colors around me began to blur, the warmth of the space replaced by a faint chill, and I felt myself being drawn back, like a thread pulled through the eye of a needle. The last thing I saw before the light faded completely was the figure's gaze, filled with a love so fierce and infinite that it left an imprint on my soul, a reminder that I would carry with me always. Yitia. It began with a sharp pull, as though an invisible thread had been yanked, drawing me from the luminous realm back toward the density of the world I'd known. The warmth that had cradled me faded, replaced by a cool emptiness that seeped into every corner of my awareness. I resisted at first, clinging to the serenity of where I had been, desperate to remain in that space of perfect love and understanding. But the pull was unrelenting, and with it came a sense of purpose, a quiet knowing that my journey wasn't finished. The descent wasn't sudden, it was slow and deliberate, like being lowered into water. As I moved farther from the light, the weight of my physical form began to settle over me again. It started faintly, a tingling at the edges of my awareness, then grew into a heaviness that pressed against my chest, my limbs, my head. My senses, dulled for what felt like an eternity, began to reawaken, and with them came a cascade of sensations, sharp, jarring, and wholly unfamiliar after the perfection I had just experienced. The first sound I heard was a low hum, faint and distant, like the murmur of waves against a shoreline. Slowly, it grew louder, morphing into a steady beeping that pierced through the fog of my awareness. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, as if weighted down by sand, but I forced them open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light above me. The transition from the soft radiance of the other realm to the stark glare of the hospital room was almost unbearable. It took a moment for the scene around me to come into focus. Machines surrounded the bed where I lay, their monitors flashing rhythmically, their wires tethered to me like lifelines. My chest rose and fell with the aid of a ventilator, each breath a mechanical whisper that felt foreign yet strangely comforting. My body ached, not with pain but with a dull, throbbing awareness that I was alive, present, and anchored once more to the physical world. Tears welled in my eyes, though I couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the shock of being back, of feeling the raw edges of reality after the ethereal perfection of the place I had left behind. Perhaps it was gratitude, a deep, overwhelming thankfulness for being given another chance. Or perhaps it was grief, the loss of that boundless love and connection that now seemed so far away. A nurse entered the room, her presence grounding me in a way that was both comforting and surreal. She smiled softly, her expression filled with relief and compassion. "You're awake," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and joy. "We didn't think—" She stopped herself, shaking her head as if the words she wanted to say were too heavy for the moment. I tried to speak, but my throat felt raw, the words catching like stones. She seemed to understand and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Take your time," she said, her touch warm and steady, like an anchor in a storm. "You've been through a lot." As she adjusted the monitors and checked my vitals, flashes of my experience flooded back to me. The light, the figures, the voice of Jesus, they were as vivid in my mind as if they were still happening. But the stark contrast of the hospital room made them feel almost dreamlike, as though they belonged to another lifetime. I wanted to tell her, to share what I had seen and felt, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something so profound, so utterly beyond the confines of language? In the days that followed, my strength slowly returned, and with it a deep, unshakable clarity. The world around me looked the same. The sterile walls of the hospital, the hum of activity in the hallways, the concerned faces of my family as they visited. But I was different, colors seemed brighter, sounds richer, and every moment carried a weight, a significance I had never noticed before. When my parents first walked into the room, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion, I saw them not just as my mother and father, but as souls connected to me in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before. The love in their eyes was a reflection of the love I had felt in that other place, and it filled me with a gratitude so profound that I could barely speak. Instead, I reached for their hands, holding them tightly, letting the silence between us say everything. As I lay there recovering, I began to piece together the lessons I had been shown. It wasn't just about the revelations I'd received, it was about what they meant for how I lived my life. The invitation Jesus had given me to walk in truth, to see my body and soul as sacred, wasn't a demand but a gift, an opportunity to align myself with the love I had experienced. I thought about the choices I had made, the habits and patterns that had kept me isolated and ashamed. And I realized that the freedom I sought wasn't something I could earn or achieve. It was something I had to accept, to live into each day with intention and grace. It was about letting go of the weight I had carried for so long and stepping into the light of who I was meant to be. When I finally left the hospital, the world outside felt new, as though it had been scrubbed clean. The air was crisp, the sunlight warm on my skin, and I stood there for a moment, simply breathing it in. I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, that the pull of old habits and fears would still be there, but I also knew that I wasn't alone, that the love I had experienced was with me, guiding me, reminding me of what truly mattered. With each step I took, I carried that love with me, a quiet but unshakable truth that had been etched into the very fabric of my being. And as I walked forward, I did so with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to live the life I had been given with open hands and an open heart.